Okay, so we are moving on to protostome animals. Okay, here are the objectives for this lecture. So there are five major animal lineages in the tree of life. Okay, so that includes sponges from the phylum Porifera, the phylum Ctenophora, those were the comb jellies, and then there's the phylum Cnidaria, cnidarians like the jellyfish, sea anemones, and hydras. And then there's the a lineage that are called the bilaterian lineages. So these are animals that are characterized by having bilateral symmetry, okay, and that divides into the protostomes and the deuterostomes. Okay, the protostomes are the most diverse and abundant of the lineages, okay, because 30 of the 30 animal phyla that have been described, 22 of them are protostomes. So we went over some of the diversity in the last lecture, but just to review, there's about 85,000 mollusks that have been named so far. About 1.2 million arthropod species are also estimated to exist, okay? And a million of those are insects. So things like beetles. Beetles are very diverse, a very diverse group of insects. So protostomes fill very important ecological roles. They live in virtually every aquatic and terrestrial habitat, and they can be either detritivores, so feeding on dead organic matter, herbivores, or carnivores. They also have ecological importance that extends to human health. So, for example, like earthworms that are responsible for aerating the soil that allows for crops to grow, or things like uh, lady beetles that eat pests of crops, so like aphids. Okay. Um, there's also some of the protostomes, which include insects. So there's some insects that are responsible for causing diseases or spreading diseases. So like mosquitoes, those are the vectors for malaria, right? So they spread the disease. Um, and there's also it can be economical impacts. So a lot of the protostomes, which include things like mollusks, are used as food. So people rely on them for food. They can also rely on them for um, other material items. So like pearls from clams, or silk from some of the silkworms. So there's a lot of uh, important roles that protostomes play in the environment that affect humans. So for the diversity, it's thought that a bilaterian ancestor was likely bilaterally symmetrical and also triploblastic. So those usually go hand in hand. If an animal is triploblastic, it's going to be bilaterally symmetrical. And so as you can see here um, at the diversity of protostomes, most of them are insects. So it's about 70% insects. And a lot of these are beetles, like I mentioned earlier. Okay. Then you have things like the chelicerates, which are uh, like spiders, scorpions, ticks, and mites, and the crustaceans. So those are from the phylum Arthropoda. All of these are arthropods. So Biologists traditionally distinguish protostomes from deuterostomes using developmental characteristics. In protostomes, the embryonic development of the mouth comes before the anus. Okay, if you remember the meaning of the word protostome, so proto meaning first, stoma meaning mouth, so first mouth. And they also have determinate cell cleavage. So that means that during development, if you the cells are already predetermined for a specific function. So if one is broken off, uh, it would lead to cell death because it would be incomplete. Whereas in deuterostomes, those cells are indeterminate during development. So if one is broken off, it just leads to um, another organism, okay? Because those cells are not yet determined, so they can develop into a full-grown organism. There's also the formation of the coelom by splitting of blocks of mesodermal cells. So protostomes were traditionally characterized by certain developmental patterns, but as I mentioned in the previous video, there are some exceptions, okay? Because in some protostomes, the anus develops before the mouth, okay? And in some cases, they develop at the same time. So there are some similar developmental characteristics that evolved independently in different lineages. And then there's other characteristics that are thought to be synapomorphies um, that were lost in some groups. So if you remember from previous lectures, when something develops independently, when similar characteristics develop independently in different lineages, that's an example of convergent evolution. Okay. Recent DNA sequence data supports two major subgroups within protostomes. So they are the Lophotrochozoans and also the Ecdysozoans. Lophotrochozoans include things like mollusks and annelid worms. So annelid worms are the ringed worms like earthworms, leeches, and polychaetes. Okay. And the ecdysozoans are like nematodes, which are the round worms, and arthropods. So that includes insects, crustaceans, arachnids. Okay, so here you can see those uh, major monophyletic groups within the protostomes. Okay, the Lophotrochozoans. So that also includes the Platyhelminthes, the flatworms. Okay, there's the annelids and the mollusks, and then there's the Ecdysozoans, which includes nematodes, um, arthropods, and then other groups like the Onychophora, which are the velvet worms, okay, and the Tardigrada. So, and also some fossils indicate protostome lineages originated in the ocean, and they made the transition from aquatic to terrestrial environments. And then there's some protos or most protostome lineages, especially things like snails and arthropods, survived on land. Okay. So they experience an adaptive radiation because of the new ecological niches that were available. Okay. The water to land transitions opened up new habitats and new resources to exploit. So for protostomes, the transition to land coincided with the adaptive radiation of plants to land. And land plants uh, increase thrive because of the increase in sunlight, carbon dioxide, okay? Because there's more of that on land than in water. And that just increased the the net primary productivity of land plants. So you're here, this phylogenetic tree is showing the transition from water to land for several of the protostomes. So as you can see, there's multiple events or multiple examples of that happening. As you can see that in Platyhelminthes, you can see that in annelids, mollusks. So for Platyhelminthes, the transition to land would be like those endoparasites, like Trematoda and Cestoda. Annelids, you know of the earthworms, those are terrestrial. For mollusks, those would be like the garden snails that you've seen. Okay. And then obviously arthropods, that's just various insects that are terrestrial. So to make the transition to land, new adaptations uh, had to allow for protostomes to exchange gases, avoid drying out, and hold up their bodies under their own weight. Because on land, gravity affects organisms greater than in the water. So terrestrial protostomes had to evolve many solutions to these challenges. So for roundworms and earthworms, they have a high surface area to volume ratio. So this increases the efficiency of gas exchange across their body. Okay. They, because of this, they are restricted to environments that are moist, okay, because otherwise they would lose too much water and dry out. For terrestrial arthropods and mollusks, they have gills or other respiratory structures inside of their body, and this minimizes water loss when they when they move on land onto land. Insects also evolved a waxy layer to minimize water loss from the body surface, and they also have the ability to close uh, body pores that they use for respiration. Because insects, like this grasshopper shown here, they don't have lungs. What they have are these openings that are called the tracheae, or sorry, that are called the spiracles that lead into respiratory tubes that are called tracheae. Okay? And those are not really visible with the naked eye, but if you look closely with the dissection microscope, you would be able to see them. They would be located adjacent to these little black dots. So it's not the black dots, but they would be right next to them. Those little tiny pores. Whoops. Okay, so we'll stop here and then we'll move on to the Lophotrochozoans in the next video. So this is going to be on your exam. Okay, so up to this point.